My name is Michael, and for 15 years I believe that my marriage to Olivia was built on trust, shared dreams, and an unspoken promise of fidelity. Our life together had been the very picture of stability, a quiet suburban home, weekend barbecues with neighbors, and whispered plans for the future. Yet beneath the calm surface of our everyday routine, an entirely different reality was unfolding. I discovered that the woman I loved was leading a secret double life in the digital realm, a world where she transformed into Eve, an enigmatic and seductive persona that captured the attention of hundreds online. At first, I noticed only minor discrepancies. Olivia had recently taken up an interest in social media, creating what she described as an art project to express herself. She spent evenings in our home office, smiling at her phone and laughing at texts that she assured me were from friends. I, too, had embraced the digital age, but my focus was always on work and family. I never considered that these late-night interactions could harbor a hidden truth. One rainy evening, when the gentle patter of raindrops provided a somber background, I found myself tidying up the study. As I rearranged a cluttered drawer, my hand brushed against an old tablet tucked away behind forgotten notebooks. Curious, I powered it on. The device opened directly into an app that I did not recognize, a sleek, modern messaging platform under the username Eve. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my ears, before I began scrolling through its contents. What I found was like a punch to the gut. The tablet contained a vibrant gallery of provocative photos, a series of artfully edited images that presented a woman who was both alluring and mysterious. The posts were accompanied by captions full of double entendres and flirtatious language. As I read through hundreds of messages filled with admiration and longing from unknown individuals, the realization slowly sank in. Olivia had been cultivating a secret online identity for years. Every carefully chosen word, every artfully composed picture, pointed toward a life that existed parallel to the one I knew. I sat there, transfixed and horrified, as the digital evidence mounted before my eyes. The Eve profile was not a fleeting experiment. It was a sophisticated persona, complete with multiple social media accounts, a dedicated following, and even private channels where personal confessions were exchanged. The stark contrast between the gentle, loving Olivia at home and the confident, seductive Eve online was staggering. I felt betrayed on multiple levels, by the woman I had trusted implicitly, and by the reality of a modern world where one could wear two faces with such ease. In the days that followed, my mind was consumed by the implications of my discovery. I rewatched old video calls, reread our shared messages, and searched my memory for any hint that might have predicted this duplicity. Every unexplained notification on her phone, every whispered conversation late at night, now took on an ominous tone. The ordinary became sinister as I began to piece together the extent of Olivia's deception. It was not enough that she had flirted with strangers online. She had built an entirely separate life, one where she was admired, desired, and free from the constraints of our everyday life. I felt as if I were living two lives at once, one that I believed was real, and another that had been hidden in plain sight. In the quiet moments of early morning, when the house was still and the only sound was the slow tick of the clock, I would stare at the blank walls and wonder how a person could harbor such a profound secret. I recalled our wedding day, the promises we had made, and the countless dreams we had woven together, and I felt an icy chill run down my spine. How could the woman I loved so deeply become someone else behind the glow of a screen? Determined to understand the truth, I began to document every detail. I printed screenshots, saved chat logs, and compiled evidence that I knew would forever alter the course of my life. I needed answers, even if the truth was painful. Each piece of evidence was a stark reminder that the Olivia I had known was not the entire story. The digital world, with its endless possibilities and hidden identities, had provided her with an escape, a way to reinvent herself away from the constraints of our shared reality. The betrayal was not only personal, it was emblematic of a broader shift in modern relationships. The ease with which one could construct an alternate identity online had blurred the lines between fantasy and reality. I began to question everything I had taken for granted about our marriage, wondering if I had been blinded by the comfort of routine to the secret life unfolding right under my nose. The more I uncovered, the deeper the wound grew, until it felt as if every cherished memory had been tainted by lies. I spent sleepless nights wrestling with conflicting emotions: anger, sorrow, disbelief, and a creeping sense of inadequacy. How had I failed to notice the signs? Was I too wrapped up in my own work and worries to see the subtle cues of her digital escape? The pain was compounded by the realization that in the world of social media, identities could be both fluid and dangerous. Olivia's transformation into Eve was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a cultural shift, where the boundaries of self were negotiated in pixels and posts. As I grappled with the enormity of the revelation, I found myself at a crossroads. I knew that confronting Olivia would shatter the fragile semblance of our life together, yet I could no longer live with the burden of uncertainty. Every moment spent in ignorance was a betrayal of my own truth. With a heavy heart and trembling resolve, I decided that the next step was inevitable. I had to confront the woman I loved, to force an explanation from the shadows where Eve had thrived for so long. Before that confrontation could come, however, I spent time trying to understand the motivations behind this digital double life. Was it a cry for help, a desire for recognition, or something darker, a need to escape the confines of a life that had grown too predictable? I began to read about digital identity and the psychology behind online personas, searching for any insight that could help me reconcile the Olivia I loved with the seductive figure on the screen. In those moments of solitary research, I discovered that I was not alone in my pain. Many had experienced the shock of discovering a loved one's secret life online, and their stories resonated with mine in haunting familiarity. Even as I delved deeper into the world of Eve, I found myself oscillating between anger and pity, betrayal and understanding. It was impossible to ignore the allure of the digital persona, a persona that allowed Olivia to escape the limitations of a single identity and explore facets of herself that I had never seen. Yet, the cost was our trust, our history, and the future we had once envisioned together. The paradox was as bitter as it was undeniable. In a world where freedom of expression was celebrated, the cost of that freedom had been the very foundation of our shared life. By the end of that turbulent week, the evidence had become overwhelming, and the quiet man I once was now a storm of emotions. I knew that the confrontation was imminent, that the digital veil had been lifted and nothing would ever be the same again. I closed the tablet, the glow of the screen fading into darkness, and prepared myself for the conversation that would change everything. In that quiet moment, I vowed that I would no longer hide from the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The hidden digital world had revealed its secrets, and I was now forced to face them head-on. The cold evening air did little to cool the heat of betrayal burning inside me as I prepared for the confrontation. I had spent the past few days agonizing over whether to confront Olivia immediately or to wait until my emotions settled enough to have a rational conversation. But deep down, I knew that time was not on my side. Every minute spent in uncertainty was a minute lost to the mounting pain and confusion that now defined my existence. I chose a quiet night when the house was cloaked in darkness, its silence punctuated only by the occasional creak of old floorboards. I sat in the living room, the evidence of Eve spread out before me on the coffee table, screenshots, chat logs, and printed images that documented a life I had never known. My hands trembled as I rehearsed the confrontation in my mind, each thought a mix of longing for the past and dread for the future. I remembered the moments of laughter and intimacy, the whispered secrets shared on lazy Sunday mornings, and now all that remained was the haunting presence of deception. When Olivia finally arrived home that night, the look on her face was one of weary resignation, as if she had been expecting something dreadful. I could see the flicker of hesitation in her eyes, a silent admission that something was amiss even before I spoke a word. I gestured for her to sit beside me on the worn-out sofa that had witnessed so many of our happier moments. The room, usually a sanctuary of warmth, now felt charged with tension and unsaid words. "Olivia," I began, my voice barely steady, "we need to talk." The words, though simple, carried the weight of years of shared trust and unspoken pain. I laid the printed evidence on the table, each document a silent testament to the life of Eve that had been hidden behind the facade of our marriage. Her eyes darted nervously over the items, and for a long moment, she said nothing. Only a deep, shuddering breath broke the silence. Then, in a voice that was both quiet and resigned, she began to speak. "Michael, I never wanted you to find out this way," she murmured, her tone a mixture of regret and sorrow. Her eyes, which once shone with affection, now reflected a deep-seated pain that mirrored my own. I pressed on, demanding answers with a tremor of controlled anger. Who is Eve? Olivia. How long have you been living this double life? I asked, each word laced with a bitterness I could no longer contain. Her silence was more damning than any accusation, and as tears began to glisten in her eyes, she confessed. Olivia revealed that the digital persona had started as a creative outlet, a way to escape the monotony of our everyday life. What began as harmless expression had grown into something far more elaborate and dangerous. Over time, Eve evolved into a seductive figure adored by an online audience, a persona that allowed her to explore desires and emotions that she felt were stifled in our marriage. With every word, I felt my world shatter a little more. I listened, numb and anguished, as she recounted the loneliness that had driven her to seek validation in a realm where anonymity granted her freedom. The confession was filled with sorrow and remorse, but it did nothing to fill the void that the revelation had created in my heart. I questioned every memory, every moment of intimacy, now overshadowed by the image of a stranger who had lived behind the screen. The room seemed to shrink around us as the conversation grew more painful. I asked, voice cracking with emotion, "How could you let this happen? Did you ever think about what it would do to us?" To me, the questions hung in the air, unanswered and accusing. Olivia's response was a soft, broken whisper. "I was lonely, Michael. I felt invisible sometimes, and Eve made me feel seen, desired. I never meant to hurt you." But those words, meant to soothe, only deepened my despair. I realized that the betrayal was not just an act of infidelity, it was a profound fracture in the trust that had once bound us together. For what felt like an eternity, we sat in silence, the only sounds the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant echo of passing cars outside. My mind raced with conflicting emotions, anger, sadness, disbelief, and a lingering hope that maybe, somehow, we could find a way to rebuild what had been lost. But as the minutes turned into hours, I realized that the foundation of our relationship had been irrevocably damaged. The painful confrontation left me feeling exposed and vulnerable. I excused myself to the solitude of our study, where I spent hours scribbling in my journal, trying to make sense of the labyrinth of betrayal and longing that now defined my every thought. I questioned not only Olivia's choices but my own. Had I been too absorbed in my work, too blind to the subtle signs of her hidden life? The self-doubt was as crushing as the betrayal itself, leaving me adrift in a sea of regret and sorrow. By the time the night gave way to a cold, gray dawn, I knew that nothing would ever be the same. The truth had been spoken, and with it came the painful realization that the woman I once loved was now a stranger in many ways. The evidence of Eve had shattered the illusion of our perfect life, leaving behind only the jagged remnants of trust. I closed the journal that morning with a heavy heart, aware that the road ahead would be long and fraught with anguish, yet determined that I must face the future with honesty, no matter how painful the truth might be. In the weeks following that fateful confrontation, my life descended into a darkness I had never known. The digital betrayal had not only torn apart the foundation of my marriage, but had also left me isolated in a world where every familiar corner of our home now seemed tainted by deception. I began to withdraw from friends and family, unable to explain the silent agony that had become my constant companion. The weight of Olivia's double life, revealed so starkly through the evidence of Eve, bore down on me like an unyielding storm. Each day felt like an endless struggle. I wandered through our once happy home as if I were a ghost, haunted by memories of laughter, shared dreams, and moments of intimacy that now felt like distant echoes of a life that no longer existed. I would often find myself pausing in the doorway of our bedroom, where the scent of her perfume still lingered, only to be overwhelmed by the bitter taste of betrayal. Every object, every photograph, was a reminder of a time when I believed in the sanctity of our love, a love now shattered into a million irreparable fragments. I spent long hours alone in the study, poring over the evidence that had upended my world. The screenshots of flirtatious messages, the provocative images, and the countless comments from strangers on Eve's profile became both a curse and a grim comfort, a constant affirmation of the betrayal that I could neither deny nor escape. I tried to fill the silence with work, throwing myself into tasks that once brought me satisfaction, yet the emptiness persisted like an unwelcome shadow. In the midst of this inner turmoil, I found solace in writing. I began to document my feelings in a journal, each entry a desperate attempt to capture the raw, unfiltered emotions that surged within me. I wrote about the betrayal, about the loneliness, and about the desperate need for answers that seemed forever out of reach. The act of writing became both a form of therapy and a painful reminder of what I had lost. With every word I penned, I felt as if I were slowly piecing together the fragments of my shattered self, trying to understand how the woman I loved could have become a stranger in the blink of an eye. Nights were the worst. I would lie awake, staring at the dark ceiling and replaying every moment of the past few weeks. The silence of the night was filled with the echoes of unsaid words and unresolved questions. I often wondered if I was to blame, if my preoccupation with work or my failure to notice the subtle signs had contributed to this betrayal. The self-recrimination was relentless, gnawing at me with every passing minute. I questioned whether I could ever trust again, whether the wounds of this betrayal would ever truly heal. As the days turned into weeks, the isolation began to shape my very identity. I stopped accepting invitations, avoided gatherings, and retreated deeper into the confines of our empty home. Even the familiar comfort of old hobbies no longer offered respite from the relentless ache of betrayal. I found myself caught in a vicious cycle of anger, sorrow, and numbing despair, a cycle from which escape seemed impossible. Despite the overwhelming darkness, there were rare moments, fleeting flashes of clarity, when I began to grasp the complexity of Olivia's actions. In my darkest hours, I would reflect on the possibility that her online alter ego, Eve, was more than a mere escape. It was a manifestation of her inner pain, a cry for recognition in a world where she felt unseen. These thoughts, however, did little to alleviate my own suffering. They only deepened the confusion. How could the very freedom of the digital world coexist with the confines of our marital life, and at what cost? In the solitude of my despair, I sought answers in books and articles about digital identity and the psychology of infidelity. I read about the allure of virtual personas and the ways in which anonymity could empower individuals to explore hidden facets of themselves. The research provided no comfort, only more questions. I learned that in a world where the line between reality and fantasy is blurred by screens and social media, trust can be the first casualty in a battle for identity and recognition. One cold morning, as I walked aimlessly through our silent neighborhood, I realized that my isolation had become a prison. I was trapped in a cycle of my own making, unable to reach out or ask for help. The betrayal, once a distant memory, had become an inseparable part of who I was. I felt that every step I took was burdened by the weight of Olivia's secret and the painful truth that our marriage would never be the same again. Yet, amid the relentless sorrow, there was a spark, a tiny, almost imperceptible hope that maybe, someday, I would find a way to heal. I clung to that hope as I slowly began to rebuild the shattered pieces of my identity. I started to attend therapy sessions, where I was forced to confront not only the betrayal but also the parts of myself that had long been hidden away. These sessions were painful, filled with raw honesty and difficult revelations, but they also offered a glimpse of redemption, a chance to reclaim the self that had been lost in the chaos of betrayal. As I write these words, I realize that the journey through isolation and inner turmoil is far from over. The scars remain, a permanent reminder of the price of deception. And yet, in the depths of my despair, I have begun to see the faint outline of a future where the pain does not define me. I know that I must eventually learn to trust again, to let the light of hope dispel the shadows of betrayal. Until that day comes, I will continue to document my journey, each entry a testament to the resilience of a heart battered by deception but still yearning for redemption. In the months that followed the darkest days of isolation and inner turmoil, I found myself standing at the threshold of a new beginning. The road to healing was not clear or smooth. It was a jagged path lined with the remnants of past pain and the fragile shoots of hope that struggled to break through. I knew that the betrayal by Olivia, the woman I had loved and trusted, would forever leave its mark on my soul. Yet, I also recognized that healing was not about erasing the past, but about learning to live with it, transforming pain into a source of strength. I began by returning to therapy with a renewed determination. The sessions, though grueling, forced me to confront the raw emotions that had once threatened to consume me entirely. I learned that forgiveness was not a singular act, but a gradual process, a series of small steps that, over time, could lead to inner peace. Slowly, I started to let go of the suffocating grip of anger, replacing it with a tentative understanding that the digital seduction was as much a cry for help from Olivia as it was an act of betrayal against our shared past. During this time, I also reached out to those I had isolated myself from, friends, family, and even colleagues who had once been a source of support. I discovered that sharing my story, in fragments if not in full, was cathartic. Each conversation, no matter how painful, chipped away at the walls I had built around my heart. I began to see that trust, though fragile, could be nurtured once again. In these interactions, I also learned to forgive myself for the perceived blindness that had allowed the betrayal to unfold. I realized that the digital age had introduced complexities into relationships that no one could have foreseen, and that my pain was not a personal failing but a consequence of a rapidly changing world. The process of healing was intertwined with a renewed focus on self-discovery. I returned to hobbies and passions that had once defined me, a love of photography, long walks in nature, and even the simple pleasure of a quiet evening with a good book. With every step I took toward reclaiming my identity, I felt the heavy burden of betrayal lighten, if only imperceptibly. I learned that while Olivia's actions had fractured our marriage, they could not wholly define who I was. I began to rebuild my sense of self, piece by piece, recognizing that the scars of the past were a testament to my resilience rather than a permanent sentence to sorrow. As I moved forward, I also attempted to understand Olivia's perspective. I realized that her descent into the digital persona of Eve had been driven by a profound loneliness, a need to be seen, to be desired, to break free from the constraints of a life that had become too predictable. Though the betrayal was inexcusable, I found that understanding its roots allowed me to see the complexities behind the act. This was not an absolution of her choices, but rather a recognition that in the tangled web of human relationships, the lines between desire, neglect, and identity are often blurred. There were still moments when the pain would surge unexpectedly. A familiar song on the radio, a photograph of happier times, or even a stray comment that hinted at the past. In those moments, I would pause and remind myself of the progress I had made. I kept a journal, not just of my grief, but also of my small victories. A smile shared with a friend, a day without overwhelming sorrow, a step taken toward rebuilding a life that had been fractured. Each entry was a declaration of my commitment to moving forward, no matter how painful the journey might be. In time, I began to see that healing was not a destination but a continuous process, a path marked by setbacks and small triumphs. I learned to embrace the complexity of my emotions, accepting that pain and hope could coexist. The digital betrayal, which had once seemed like an insurmountable chasm, was gradually becoming a part of my story, a dark chapter that, while painful, had ultimately led me to a deeper understanding of myself and the nature of trust. Today, as I reflect on the tumultuous journey from the discovery of Olivia's secret digital life to the slow emergence of healing, I realize that redemption is possible even in the aftermath of profound betrayal. I am not the same man I was before that fateful day. I carry the scars of the past, but I also carry a newfound strength born of adversity. I have learned that forgiveness is not about forgetting the pain, but about accepting it as part of the intricate tapestry of life. And while the shadow of Eve may always linger at the edges of my memory, I now choose to focus on the light that can emerge from even the darkest moments. As I continue on this uncertain path, I remain committed to rebuilding not just my relationship with the past, but also with myself. I know that the wounds will never fully vanish, but they can serve as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, a spirit capable of rising above even the deepest betrayals. With each new day, I take one more step toward a future defined not by the pain of what was lost, but by the hope of what can be rebuilt. I embrace the lessons of the past, using them as a foundation to create a life that honors both the love I once knew and the hard-won wisdom that now guides me.